Okay, people are starting to join, but I think just for time, let's get going. So, hello to everybody who's joining from around the world. It's very nice to have you here and see you. This recording will be available afterwards, so if you're just starting to join, don't worry about that. Just to give you a bit of context for the Nursing Now Challenge Global Book Club, this is the first one between author Sarah DiGregorio and our co-host Jill White, and it'll be the first of many book clubs to come that we hope will do an amazing program of work over the months and years to come, and hopefully you may be inspired to start your own book club. So the idea came from a place of hoping to create a space for sharing thoughts on books that were directly or indirectly related to nursing and midwifery, engaging with authors like Sarah to explore the origins behind the book and to appreciate the word, allowing for healthy and respectful flow of conversation and stimulating ideas and thoughts to broaden our understanding of the books, their story and meaning. And as I say, members might decide to start up their own book clubs or join existing ones. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Jill, and to you, Sarah. So have a great session.
Thanks, Kate. Hello, everybody from all parts of the world. I'm sitting here in Sydney. It's Thursday morning for me. I know it's Wednesday for most of the rest of you. I'm a nurse and a midwife and a retired nursing academic. And I came to Sarah's book through Twitter, good old social media, and I saw a quote and it absolutely grabbed me. And I went straight to my bookshop and ordered the book. And when the book came, I opened the first page and I was gone. This was a book I was going to read. I was going to read it right to the end, no question. And I really was particularly taken by something that Sarah wrote on the first page, where she was speaking about the inhuman labyrinth of the US healthcare system. And she said this: but every now and then, someone in that labyrinth manages to see you, hear you, and offer exactly what you need. For me, these encounters stand out with crystalline clarity. They were moments of relief. Someone was going to help us. Someone could help us, even when that help didn't include cure, even when there wasn't a fix. At almost every single time, and almost every single time, the person who offered what we needed was a nurse. And I've come to understand that that was not a coincidence. So this non-nurse sees us, and I'd like to say good morning, good evening, good afternoon, Sarah. Welcome, and what a fantastic privilege it is for us to see you and to have some time to speak with you. So Sarah, I wonder if you'd start by telling us a little bit about yourself, and particularly how you became engaged with our magnificent professions of nursing and midwifery, and how you came to see that work.
Thank you so much for that incredibly kind introduction, Jill, and your kind assessment of the book. It means a lot to me. And thank you so much to everyone at the Nursing Now Challenge, and in particular, Professor Aisha Holloway, who really spearheaded this and made this conversation happen. So yes, I'm a journalist. I am based in New York City, so it's good evening for me, but good morning to you, and good afternoon, good evening to everybody else. I am a journalist who focuses on healthcare, and I am also someone who has been in the United States healthcare system really for all of my life. So those two things for me are very connected. The questions that I have as a journalist often flow from questions that occurred to me as a family member. And that's where taking care really originated for me. When I was growing up, both of my parents were quite chronically ill. My mother was diagnosed with breast cancer when I was 5, and she passed away when I was 21. My father struggled with substance use disorder all of his life, and also died relatively young. So that was sort of my childhood was really very much about accompanying my parents through this labyrinth. And I think of it, as you said, as a labyrinth with the highest stakes, because it's the survival of your most beloved people. And then my daughter was also born at 28 weeks, so quite prematurely. And so again, I found myself in the healthcare system, Luckily, I'm very grateful to say that after months of intensive care and then years of follow-up care, she is now a healthy, happy 8-year-old. But I did, out of that experience, I wrote about premature birth. And then when I was thinking about, the way that healthcare is represented in the media, so often really obscures the work of nurses. It's not included, especially in media that's directed at the general public. There's a statistic in the United States that healthcare news stories only quote nurses as experts 2% of the time. That's absolutely not reflective of their importance in the system. And I knew that as someone who had been there. And so really that's where this book came from, was looking back on those experiences and wanting to understand them, and thinking also that there was a huge gap. And it was in the public's interest to understand nurses and nursing.
Terrific. Thanks so much. In fact, I was enchanted by in your introduction where you were speaking about being at a book talk about your first book, your book on early times, on your baby being in NICU, a neonatal intensive care unit, and a gentleman asked you to speak about NICU nurses, and you found yourself saying, "I love them, but no other words." And I thought it was terrific that you then went on in the book to reference a quote that's often attributed to Maya Angelou. I've no idea if in fact she ever did write it, but that quote about people may forget what you did, but they'll never forget how they made you feel. And your appreciation but critique of that. And I wonder if you'd like to read that next section from there, where you talk about non-nurses focusing on how nurses make us feel.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. And I do want to say before I start this that, I do understand from the public's point of view, we have emotion for nurses. And I think that that's a good place to start, but it can't be where we finish. And so this is what I wrote about that. When we non-nurses focus on how nurses make us feel, we sometimes fail to recognize their knowledge, or we implicitly devalue their professionalism. We essentialize them in gendered ways. She was like a mother, like a sister. We make saints or martyrs of them. We send them pizza or flowers while withholding the kind of respect and compensation physicians routinely command. In the long wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, perhaps many Americans have a better understanding of how much we all depend on nurses. But it's worth examining their place in our collective imagination and in our healthcare systems, and reckoning with how that affects the way they are treated, the ways they treat each other, the ways they are able to work, and in turn, how that affects the kind of care available to all of us.
It's a very potent statement. I think all of you who are on board in this recording will understand and appreciate. And I think that quote, I love that quote, but for me that quote also is a synthesis of what the rest of the whole book unpacks. It unpacks how all of those things affect the kind of care that nurses aren't enabled to give to people. So thank you for those beautiful words. And one of the things about we nurses, and I hope you don't mind all of the 200 plus of you out there at the moment, mind me sort of trying to make a collective statement about what we think, but I know we sort of rise up when people say really nice things about us. Doesn't happen all that often, but when it does, we feel really good. But I want to just, for those of you who may not have finished this book, it is a fantastic book, and it challenges us. And it challenges us because it's not just, one of the terms that they use in sort of book clubs in talking about literature is the word hagiography. And I know it's not a commonly used word, but what it means is the sort of book often written about biographies where someone just blows smoke, someone just says all the positive things about someone, never really critiquing their life or their time or their experience. And I don't think there's anybody in the world who hasn't had blue spots, black spots in their life, things they would like to have done differently, and that a recording of one's life or one's experience has got to include those things. And therefore, I was delighted, actually, Sarah, uncomfortable but delighted when you called us out on a few of the uncomfortable truths that you saw of our profession. And one that no doubt most people will pick up on was your critique of Nightingale, and we'll go on and talk about that in a little while. And I think the turn of phrase, one of my favourites in the book, and I'm going to ask Sarah what her favourites are later, is talking about Nightingale putting nursing in a restrictive, exclusionary Victorian corset. I just think that's beautiful. And as I say, we'll talk about that in a little while. But you also name our most recently thought through hypocrisies. And again, I'm going to ask Sarah if you would read this bit that makes us uncomfortable, but puts a mirror to us that we need to see. The section, but nurses themselves, Sarah, if you could.
Absolutely. But nurses themselves do not always live up to their moral and ethical obligations to provide patient-centered care without bias. Nursing has its own serious internal problems, and those problems profoundly affect nurses' lives and their abilities to provide ethical care to the public. For instance, nursing has a very specific historical and present-day problem with racism. A 2021 study found that a staggering 92% of Black nurses say that they have personally experienced racism directed against them in the workplace, from peer colleagues, nurse leaders, and patients in roughly equal numbers.
And I think when we look at our colleagues in all of the countries that we are currently sitting in as part of this book club, the notion of racism within and through either nurse to patient or nurse to nurse it is an extremely important acknowledgement. We're not going to unpack that in this session, and I would encourage everybody to make sure you're listening into this part 2 of our conversation with Sarah, which will happen in mid-February, where we're going to talk about power much more and a little more about racism. But I think holding some of this up to us to reflect on is important. And one of the reasons I want to raise it now is that I want those who are listening and taking part in this book club to have some time between now and February to think about notions of racism, of gender, of class, and of power, so that we can have a more in-depth conversation at that stage. So thank you for that uncomfortable truth, Sarah. But I think let's take a look back. Let's move back in time and see where some of this might have had its genesis. So in your chapter on origins, the first words are, nursing is a thread running through all human history. Nurses were at the events that define our world. It's a really interesting concept, isn't it? And you raise a really important philosophical question here. And let me read some of your words, if I may. Historians and anthropologists often point to pivotal moments that distinguish the evolution of early humans, when we started making tools and decorative objects, or using fire to cook, or when we cooperated in sharing food. But what about the impulse to staunch bleeding? What about helping someone give birth? What about sitting with someone who's dying? These are interactions that define humans as much as the use of tools, fire, and agriculture. That is so little talked about these days, or thought about, I think, when we look back to our origins. So, Sarah, you did a really comprehensive look back to ancient and not so ancient times. And let me just, for those of you who are looking, you can see all of my page markings here. But I also want to point out the extraordinary detailed referencing that Sarah has in the back of her book. It makes it a really important piece of work. It's not just a novel. It's not just a piece of writing. It's a well-researched piece. So Sarah, can you take some time now and walk us through those discoveries that have led you to your conclusions about nursing?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So when you think about it, and you're right, we don't often conceptualize nursing as something that is ancient, is of prehistory. And yet, when you think about it logically, how would a society grow and function without organized care for people in moments of vulnerability? Because we do all live in these vulnerable human bodies. We always have, all of us. And vulnerability is not a binary state. It's a state that we move in and out of throughout our lives, when we are giving birth, when we are being born, when we are ill or injured, when we are dying. And I think it's really important, actually, to put this frame on our idea of what it means to be human, because so often the way that we think about humans as a species has to do with survival of the fittest, and I get mine at the expense of you. And a lot of the histories that we all know are about domination. They're about taking from somebody and growing your empire at the expense of somebody else. And it's very much about power and domination. But in fact, you can absolutely look at human history from another angle, which is just as valid, and I would say is more important to understand ourselves this way, which is that we have always organized skilled care for our community members. If we didn't, our societies would never have thrived the way that they have. And I mean this in all over the world. It's not exclusive to any one place or to any one people. Nursing has infinite origin stories and has come from everywhere, because it is I think of it as a skilled expression of our shared humanity. And so the evidence for this is, when you look in the fossil record, you can see that people have survived illnesses and injuries that they could not have survived without nursing care. So, however rudimentary that care might have been in Neolithic times, there is an example of a skeleton of a young man that was found at a dig in what is now Vietnam, was a Neolithic community. And this young man had a congenital condition that he was born with that caused him to become, it was a spinal condition that caused him to become progressively paralyzed until he was a paraplegic in his early teens. And the archaeologists could tell this from the state of his bones. Nevertheless, he lived for another 10 years. And so he would have needed help chewing. I mean, he certainly couldn't have gotten food or water himself. He would have needed help chewing. He would have needed help with positioning to tend to his skin and prevent infection. So there is evidence for this, and it's not the only example. And what's interesting about it, I think, is that it's only relatively recently that archaeologists have brought this knowledge forward in terms of thinking of it as healthcare that existed in prehistoric times. So certainly it was always noted when a skeleton exhibited an injury that had healed, or there was evidence of an illness. But it's interesting because that idea of nursing sometimes being elided or only being seen in relief. So you see the healing, but you don't see the hands that made the healing. And I think it's important to bring it forward, because it had to have been there for the realities that these bones tell us, that people did organize care for their community members. And there's an archaeologist named Lorna Tilley, who's actually Australian, She previously worked in nursing, and she has been very instrumental in bringing forward this idea of the bioarchaeology of care. So understanding ourselves as a species for whom it is completely natural, actually, to organize care for each other and to take care of each other. And that we should think of ourselves that way when we make policy decisions and when we decide how are we going to organize ourselves. Well, it's natural for us to take care of each other, to make sure that no one gets left behind.
Yeah, and I think progressively we are seeing the evidence, we're recognizing, let me say, the evidence of profound systems of healing within First Nations cultures everywhere around the world. We certainly have belatedly in Australia, where we have the oldest continuous culture on the planet, which we've not recognised or treated kindly or appropriately or with due recognition. The health systems within many of the First Nations cultures are starting to be recognised. And in fact, in your book, I don't know if you want to say anything about what you found of Indian healing and Indian culture at all.
Yes, that would be wonderful. Thank you for bringing that up. You know, I think people think of nursing as something that arose in relation to hospitals or in relation to physicians. But in fact, you know, if we think about nursing as very hands-on, very intimate care, also as a holistic kind of care, thinking about people in their environment, in their contexts, thinking about prevention, advocacy, all of those, you know, you can come up with a definition of nursing, and it's difficult to define nursing, but you come up with a definition of nursing that's roughly like that, and you can trace it through so many contexts. So the ancient Indian context is really strong, very interesting. They're actually the first documented nursing school was opened in ancient India 2,500 years ago. It was only for men at the time, and the Indian traditional medicine system is called Ayurveda. It's quite ancient, still exists today. And in the Ayurvedic tradition, there is lots of written documentation. So we know a lot about this. And there is a text from ancient India that describes the roles of different healthcare professionals from more than 2,000 years ago. And it says, healthcare has 4 fundamental pillars. And without these 4 pillars, healthcare couldn't stand up. So the pillars are the nurse, the physician, the patient, and the medicine. And that each one of these pillars has different roles, but they are all equally critical to the provision of healthcare.
Interesting. And it actually brings us very nicely to your next chapter, which you entitle Hierarchy, and the subtitle is The Making of the Big Lie. And the rest of that subtitle is essentially female and always subordinate. And your proposition, if I may quote, the idea that nursing is by definition a female practice has not been good for anyone. I wonder if you can delve a little more into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the idea that it's an essentially female practice is false. So that's the first problem with it. We know from history.
Telling us about India.
Yeah, right. So we know from history that men always were nurses. They nursed in many different contexts and in many different traditions. And they continue to nurse. The reason I think it's bad for everyone has to do with the idea of, you know, gender essentialism. And so the idea that, you know, if we say to women and girls, you know, being interested in power and leadership is not for women. Or if we say to boys and men, you know, if you're feeling like you want to care or you want to help people, that's insufficiently masculine. I think that idea is actually where a lot of what we would maybe call toxic masculinity comes from. The idea that we're telling men and boys that actually they shouldn't care, they shouldn't want to help because that's not what men do, but actually it is what men do. And I think that, you know, so many of the problems in the world now and in the past do have some root in this idea of toxic masculinity, the idea that men are not supposed to be caring. And I think it's an injury actually to men, because I think that they do care. And they are capable of that. Now, at the same time, I want to say I was very sensitive, especially when I started researching and writing the book. I wasn't as sensitive to this idea. And the idea, I was very sympathetic to the idea that there's a tradition in nursing that maybe has its roots in maternal caring. And I just want to say that actually maternal caring is incredibly powerful. There is nothing wrong with an association with maternal caring. And if individual nurses feel that this has a resonance for them, I think it's a force for good in the world. But the idea that nursing is for women, and it has served to keep women down and in a certain place, and it has cut men off from a really important part of their humanity. And so I think it's really an injury to everybody.
So certainly you raise issues of racism, you raise issues of gender. I want to move a little probably to class. And you name as really critical, and you name it an inflection point in the hierarchy of healthcare, the opening of the first medical school. And I wonder if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, I call that an inflection point because I think it was, and this was it's not really a point, it's like a span of several hundred years.
Yeah.
But I do call it an inflection.
It's a long point. It's a big point.
So when it marked the medical schools in the context of Europe, the first medical schools marked this transition to a new kind of hierarchy. So previously, as I said, you can certainly find nursing ethos from prehistory and on forward. But the idea of practicing within a certain definition of care was not really something that people found important. So before the establishment of medical universities, it wasn't so important to someone to say, I'm a pharmacist, or I'm a nurse, I'm a physician, I'm a respiratory therapist. That those strict definitions are really a product of our system. They're not something that naturally occurred. And so when the first medical universities were founded in Europe in the Middle Ages, except with the notable exception of the University of Salerno in Italy, they barred women. So there was no way to be a woman and to be a licensed physician. In addition, of course, you had to have resources to go to medical school. You had to be someone who had access to that. So there's a class component coming into that. Now, meanwhile, these new physicians, these new university educated physicians, they're coming into a healthcare system that already existed. It's not that there was no care. There was care. It was, by the systems of the time. And they had to come up with a reason why they existed. Because it wasn't like, there were no antibiotics, there was no chemotherapy or CAT scans or anything like that. The new physicians of these new university medical schools were practicing with the theory of the humors, just like everybody else, but they were considering themselves a really different breed. And so what they did was they had to construct a difference. So what they did was they embarked on a centuries-long campaign to denigrate what they called irregular providers, irregular healers. And so that was women by definition. If you were a woman who was providing healthcare, you were doing it without a license, and you were providing healthcare illegally by definition. Same goes for men who didn't have the status to go to school.
The results, like the tools, the magic thermometer or whatever was around at the time that was, kept very close and only to be used by these.
Yes, exactly. So these trappings of their status, and they really had to create a difference. They used their tools, they used their status, and people were charged with, people who had been providing healthcare for for their entire lives were actually brought before court and charged with, practicing without a license. And what I think is important about this is that it really is the turning point where it brings us into our current healthcare hierarchy, which I think is a false hierarchy, which posits that physicians are at the top and everyone else serves to serve physicians. And that was something that had to be created. It's not something that naturally occurred.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting expose of how we got to this crazy point. And funnily enough, we still hear it now when when we hear doctors say, yes, but I'm entitled to this because I've had 12 years, 20 years, whatever, of education. And you say, excuse me, but a nurse practitioner has had at least that many years of both experience and tertiary education. That's a false premise.
Yeah.
Completely.
Oh, yeah. And
but they're still not seen.
No, you can absolutely trace even the language that was used, calling, like, if from the Middle Ages, calling women practitioners quacks, calling them dangerous for patient safety, saying that, calling them everything really from, a stupid to a witch, anything in this continuum of denigrating them. You can actually follow this thread directly, and speaking from an American perspective, to the American Medical Association, which lobbies as hard as it can to prevent nurse practitioners from practicing to the full extent of their licenses. It is a very, very organized and vitriolic campaign, and they use terms around patient safety, and none of this is backed up by the evidence. But they are really pulling on something very old, and they're drawing on, I think, very misogynistic and classist tropes about who deserves to, who is safe.
Yeah, it's that double-edged sword of regulation, isn't it? Regulation about regulation for always as regulation for the protection of the public, but regulation then becomes protection of the provider as well. We have, certainly in Australia, we have our version of an AMA, still called the AMA, Australian Medical Association, and they are still up to exactly those same tricks and tropes, which actually blends. Sorry.
Well, it's protecting. Should be protecting patients, but it is protecting one group's financial interests.
Yeah, and that brings us to identity very nicely. And chapter 3 begins. It's called Identity, and the subtitle is "Who is a Nurse and the Wartime Struggle for the Right to Care." In this chapter, I love it. This for those of you who haven't read it, read this chapter. It's a beauty. It really, in Australia, we would say, use the term "get stuck into." In other words, challenges notions of Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, and introduces us to the juxtaposition, really, the contrasting of Mary Seacole and Florence Nightingale. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you see as the good, the bad, and the ugly of a very well-connected, educated British woman who was Florence Nightingale?
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to say that the reason that I think Florence Nightingale is important to examine is because of the place that she holds in the collective imagination about who is a nurse. So it's not that I set out to cancel Florence Nightingale or to even pass judgment on her as a person, really, in any way, but really to, I think it's very important that we reckon with what has, her place as sort of the archetypal nurse or the iconic nurse, and her role in defining that actually is really important to take apart, because I think that, like any lone hero myth, it's a myth. The reality of nursing and nursing history is far more complex than the idea that Florence Nightingale, quote unquote, invented or founded nursing, even the idea that she founded modern nursing. It's just not true. I mean, she went to nursing school, right? So she was a nurse, and she couldn't, she certainly made a lot of changes, and she had a very distinct vision of nursing, which she put forward. But that was just one woman's vision of nursing. And it was important, but it's not the font of nursing itself. So I really wanted to make sure that I made that clear. And I think the reason it's important, well, I'm sure everyone sort of knows about what she did, but I just want to go back a little bit and describe what she did at first, which was that she was tasked by the British government to put together a nursing corps, a group of nurses, to go and provide nursing care in the British hospitals during the Crimean War. And it was the first time that the British government had contracted with female nurses to professional trained nurses to provide care. So this is a big deal. It's a really big deal in her context, because most of the armed forces were against her. People had the idea that women, upper class, middle class women working with men in the context of a war zone, it was really quite subversive, or it was quite subversive. And it aroused a lot of anxiety. But Florence Nightingale was chosen for a reason. And the reason is that she was maybe the only one who could have made this endeavor palatable to Victorian Britain. She was an upper class woman. She knew a lot of people in government. She was very well placed, very well educated. And when she put together her nursing corps, she was very conscious of experience. So she wanted experienced nurses, but she was also very conscious of class. And she deployed people differently depending on what class they were from. And she had a really very, very strict adherence to the idea of hierarchy. So her vision of nursing was that it was entirely female, and that nursing had its own command structure that was entirely female, but was really subordinate to the male doctors. So it's not that every nurse was answering to a man. The nurses had their own command structure, which she felt was very, very specifically, it was women's work. It was class stratified. She would not, for instance, have thought to promote a quote unquote lower class nurse to a head nurse. And it was very rigidly dependent on that hierarchy. So in terms of her nursing practice and the way that she directed her nurses to work, if a physician had not directed that a man be given food or water, she would not allow them to get food or water. So it was very much, we have absolute obedience to doctor's orders. And in a way, this was very savvy, because what did she do? She actually made this what could have been incredibly subversive thing, she made it palatable. And it was, in fact, a tremendous success. People lionized her. She really succeeded in creating this new version of British nursing, which was white, middle class, or upper class women. Meanwhile, perhaps many of you know the story of Mary Seacole, who was also a very experienced nurse. She was Jamaican British. She actually came to London to volunteer for Nightingale's nursing corps, and she was turned away because of the color of her skin, which she writes about in her autobiography. Nevertheless, she went to Crimea and she nursed anyway. And the history of nursing is much more complicated than these two women, right? And I object sometimes to the way that it's like, we're going to pit these two against each other. It is ahistorical. The Russians had a nursing corps, the French had a nursing corps. There was all kinds of nursing going on. But it's really important then to say Florence Nightingale's version of nursing, what is not the be all and end all, and what has happened because she has been held up as the icon. There is actually, I have found this book very useful. It's called Beyond Nightingale by Carol Helmstadter. She argues that the reason that Nightingale was so successful was because it was class structured, and it was comforting to those in power. And she was an agent of the British Empire. There was nothing subversive about her. But
And
that,
I could see that she actually had a very strong understanding of the politics of policy process.
absolutely.
And we'll come back to this in the February, where we're going to talk about power and influence, and there'll be lots of conversation in relation to that. So we might just move on. We've got about 6 minutes until we get to questions, but there's a couple of things I really want to ask you about, not to leave any of that behind. But I do want you to spend just a couple of minutes, if you could. You describe the book as a love letter to nursing's vast possibilities. I went, oh, when it's not a love letter to nurses, it's not a love letter to nursing, it's a love letter to nursing's possibilities. And you go on to talk about, the subtitle of the book is The Story of Nursing, Its Power to Change the World. And you talk about climate change, built environment, policy leadership impacts. And they impact on how nurses see the symptoms of these problems written on the bodies of our patients, which suggests that in nursing's vast possibilities, do you see political action? Do you see the need to rise above the nurse-patient dyad into a completely other area of action? If we do indeed have the power to change the world. Yeah, your thoughts.
Such a great question. It gets right to the heart of kind of everything. It's a love letter to nursing's vast possibilities, really, because as a journalist, it's my duty to describe what is and not what I wish were true. But also to describe a tension that I have seen in nursing, which is, and I think that this has been imposed on nurses from without, but also has been enforced within. This idea that nurses should be nice, should keep their heads down and just focus on patient care, don't rock the boat. And then there have also always been nurses who have said, no, that's not what nursing is. Actually, what we know and how we know it can work in the world in all these different ways. And so, I think that is happening. That has always been happening. And I think that is the vast possibility of nursing. I was actually just talking about Lavinia Dock today. And this is such a great example how, we think of this stuff as being a kind of a modern take on things, that everyone's talking about social justice now. It's not modern. Lavinia Dock was a nurse who was born in 1858, and she was a huge proponent of women's right to vote in the United States. And in 1913, the American Nursing Association got together and they voted to recommend that women should not get the right to vote. So as an organization, they were opposed to it. And Lavinia Dock was absolutely apoplectic about this. And she responded in the American Journal of Nursing, I believe I might be getting that journal title wrong, but she responded, if we close our minds to all but professional subjects, we will in time lose our usefulness. So I'm paraphrasing there. But what she was saying was that actually fighting for women's right to vote, that is nursing, because nursing is concerned with the causes of suffering and the roots of injustice, which lead to ill health. And so nurses cannot not engage in those things if they hope to continue to be useful as nurses. And I saw this in so many ways. I'll just give you one example. There's a nurse who worked in in Wisconsin, she was seeing a big uptick of asthma cases in the children that she was caring for. And then she came to realize that because of climate change, these apartment buildings were flooding. And every time they flooded, mold would grow. And then the mold would make its way up the airways, and it was impacting these children's ability to breathe. These children were low-income children. They came from predominantly immigrant backgrounds. So you can see these layers of, you know, the causes of ill health are so complex and so rooted in societal issues. And so when nurses...
Social determinants of health.
What's that?
Social determinants of health.
Yes, the social determinants of health. And when nurses know things, they notice problems before anyone else. And so that could be in an individual clinical encounter, but you can also think about it in more macro senses. And nurses are the ones who know.
And what we do with what we know, I think, is going to be a really important part of our next conversation in February, because I think it absolutely speaks to that notion of influence. If you heard that noise, that was my alarm saying that it's nearly time that we went to questions, but I've got one more thing I have to ask you before that. And that is, when any of us write, and I'm not suggesting that I write the way you write, or would call myself an author, but sometimes one writes something and you read it later that day or the next day and you think, oh my God, did I write that? That's actually quite good. That's what I could do. I'm going to ask you, in this, you know, many thousands and thousands of words, which are the words that you feel really just, oh, wow, I love that? Can I ask you to read those?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. I'm not sure I feel exactly that way about it, but I feel I did want to read this tonight because I wrote the last part of the book, and not, you know, this is to bring things down, but I wrote the last part of the book just after the Uvalde massacre happened here in the United States, which was a school shooting that we had here. And I was finding it extremely difficult to focus on the anything and to feel hope. And I wrote this and I thought maybe it's useful for tonight too, because I do think it requires us all right now to have a radical imagination for hope for the future, because again, and as always, we find ourselves in an extraordinarily painful moment. So I'll read this. Whether you are a nurse or not, imagine it. Imagine a world in which the conditions necessary for health are enjoyed by all people. Nurses have a unique ability to bring such a world to fruition if they choose it. The rest of us can help. We are not nurses, but we can remember that Neolithic boy whose vertebrae fused as he grew, whose community nevertheless did not let him die of starvation or infection. We can do that too. We can refuse to be ruled by the dark logic of domination, some cruel fantasy of survival of the fittest. We can choose something different. We can look to ethical nursing and we can emulate it. I carry in my body the transformative nursing care I have received. We can carry it, we can multiply it, we can pass it on.
I find myself very choked up when I hear you do that. And I thank you for reading that for us. And Kate, I'm handing to you and look at all the hearts flying up the side of the screen. Sarah, I don't know if you can see them. Kate, over to you, my dear.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for all the questions that you've been sending. It's brilliant. Carol has just asked quite rightly, have you ever considered becoming a nurse, Sarah?
What a great question. It's so funny. I wished I was a nurse as I was writing it. I really did, because how could you not, talking to all these brilliant nurses all day? I think that I think that I'm better off where I am with my particular strengths. But yes, I think about that a lot. It made me think about that a lot because it resonates with me so deeply.
Yeah,
we
absolutely.
have a wonderful graduate entry nursing program for you here in Australia. You're very welcome come and do
Thank
it. 2
you.
years.
I'll
And
apply.
Carol, thank you very much for your second question. It's about policy. I'm gonna hold that off for the February session because it's a really involved question and something that we've talked about in the February session. So I'll write that down. It's a brilliant question and I'll pass that on. Angelica said, in your research for the book, did you come across any other insights that challenged your perceptions or assumptions about nurses and the nursing profession, or those that the general public may have?
Gosh, I found it to be it was, writing the book was truly what's in the book is truly a learning journey for me. I didn't know any of this before I started. I only knew that there was something there, and that I needed to know, and that I knew that other people needed to know as well. I think there are a lot of bad assumptions about nurses. Oftentimes people don't understand even just basic things about what nurses do, and the idea that it's an independent discipline, and that nursing practice is its own thing that exists independently of other kinds of practice. And so I really relish telling people about it, because I always feel like I'm delivering new information. And I love to tell people, I always seek out nurse practitioners for my own care. I mean, always. And I encourage others to do the same. I love to quote statistics at people about the effectiveness of nurse practitioner care. And the other thing that I think is important that people don't know, and that I like to tell people, and that I didn't know, was the relationship between nurse staffing and patient outcomes. This is, of course, decades and decades of research. We know for a fact that the better the level of nurse staffing, the better the outcomes for patients. In the United States, in hospitals, the fee for nursing is wrapped up into room and board, which completely obscures, in the financial sense, the importance of nursing care to patient outcomes. And so that's a really important piece of information that the general public needs to understand. I'm sorry if you can hear that. It's my dog. She wandered in here. And I think of this often because when many of my friends and I were getting pregnant, and we were talking about what hospital did you deliver at, what hospital, and we live in New York City, so we're lucky enough to have choices. We never once said to each other, what's the nurse staffing ratio on the labor and delivery floor? But we should have. That is exactly what we should have looked into more than anything else. So it's, those kinds of misunderstandings and lack of understanding that the public has that I like to deliver that information.
Thank you. Just a third question from Carol. I am an HIV/AIDS nurse, and we HIV nurses have always seen, witnessed, and advocated about human rights as integral to health. We must continue this and beyond HIV and be very loud about it. But more than being loud, we have solutions and must be at tables that address these policy issues. Nurses must be involved in policy. How do we encourage and expand the policy role of nurses as individuals and as a profession?
That is a great question. Maybe Jill
We
has.
need to talk about next in our next session. It's music to Aisha's and my heart. So we'll have lots to challenge about that. But sorry, Sarah, I should leave it to you to answer the question. But important.
It might be a good time to introduce Aisha, actually. Aisha Holloway, the Programme Director of Nursing Now Challenge, has joined us. Hello, Aisha.
Hello, everyone. Hello. So sorry, I just missed that first sort of 5 or 10 minutes. I was stuck in an Uber coming from one side of London to the other. I'd been at an event which was health related, but I have so enjoyed this book club. And Jill, I was with you and all the love hearts that came, because that reading at the end, I thought, oh my gosh, I think what we need to do is get that onto some kind of print, and then we can sell it and use the money to reinvest in educational opportunities for nursing or something, because it's such beautiful wording, as the whole book is. And I don't know if people have joined us and have read the book, or are just listening in and are now, we've got a few people saying, I'm going to buy the book, I want to read it. And I mean, I think that's what we want to do. We've wanted to create an opportunity for people to come together and just take the time that we don't have to consider things related to our profession, and whether that be directly about nursing or other areas that relate to nursing, and that will come over the next 12 months as we bring in other authors and other areas of interest for us. But as nurses, and this has come as a thread through, we can see the threat that we have come under through the ages. And I think this is about us now at this time really engaging with the narrative and who we are and what we are. And to do that, we have to understand our origins, our beginnings, what our purpose is in society. And that's what this is about. It's about engagement with that, taking an hour out to just think, as a nurse, what does that mean? And as a nurse, what is my purpose? And as a nurse, how do I offer a narrative to others about what I do? And I think that's what this has offered us. And I'm so grateful. I mean, Jill and Sarah, they haven't practiced, but it was absolutely wonderful. And while this was going on, I was messaging Kate and I said, this needs to be not just for nurses. This hour, it has to be archived as a historical account in 2023 of a discussion about nursing and what we were thinking at the time. And that's what needs to happen with this. And we will explore how we make this happen. And we want to get out there. Here's the thing, this is our inaugural book club, and we'll hopefully remember, were you there at that first book club where there was 25, we had 222 people register, and we have asked people to register even if they weren't able to come this evening, because we can then share the recording with them so we know who it was. So we think 222 is a really good start for us, but we want to grow this. So the 25, if you can tell 5 other people about it and get everyone involved, you don't have to come to everyone, but hopefully the second episode, I'm going to have a cup of tea and a bit of cake and I'll just get myself set up. It's almost like therapy, I have to say. So I can't tell you what a joyful experience this has been. And hopefully, please, the people who have joined us, I know some of the names. I know Andreas, I see, is there. Angelique is there. And lots of people who are part of our wonderful community. And Julie Kirk's been on scene. She's enjoyed it. I'm not going to mention everyone because it'll be like the Oscars then. But thank you so much, Aramoke, who is my PhD student. She's just got her award letter for her PhD. She's from Nigeria. She's looked at vaccination and maternal and child health. And this is the wonder of nursing and the joy that it brings, and bringing this global community together as a collective to think about what nursing is just a wonderful opportunity. So hopefully it's our gift to you. Sarah, you are definitely a gift to nursing. And what better person than our amazing Jill White to host this session? I don't know who's going to follow you, Jill, but it might be that this is your job.
I'll happily do it. I really enjoy it.
It's wonderful.
Kate, did you have something else you wanted to put in? Because I've got one last question.
No, it's just
for Sarah.
No, it's your final question, wrap up comments, and huge thanks to you both. Go for it, Jill.
So what next? What are you going to do for us, Sarah? How are you going to help us get the message out? Or maybe we should just be grateful that you've done your bit. So Sarah DiGregorio, gorgeous woman, fantastic work. What's next for you?
Well, first, I just want to say, in response to what Aisha said, that nursing is a gift to me, and I feel that nursing is a gift to all of us. And when I wrote this book, I just reflected your work. So collectively, your work is what's reflected here, I didn't do it, you did it. So that's how I feel about it. What's next for me? Well, I am continuing to write about healthcare. I do have a book proposal out that I can't talk about right now because it's like with publishers. It is another healthcare book. Hopefully will resonate with similar audiences. And also I will say the paperback of Taking Care comes out in May. So then there'll be another opportunity for maybe new audiences as to reach more people. But I certainly, right now, I am very grateful that many nursing organizations have reached out to me to speak with them. And it's just such a joy and an honor for me to be talking about this. I mean, it kind of feels like a continuation of writing the book, because then I can be in conversation with nurses. And every time I'm in the room with nurses, I find out something new and something exciting. And it's like the privilege of my life. So that's where I'm at, and that's what's next for me.
It's so wonderful. Can I just say also the translation? That's what we need, the translation of this book also, which I know isn't in your gift, Sarah, but I think if we can create enough of interest about this round the world, then we can make this available to all nurses and all members of society, because this is just a beautiful, beautiful, I don't even know what the word is for it yet. I can't express it, but it's a beautiful thing for nurses to have about
It's a
them.
love letter.
It's a love letter. It's a love letter. That is it. That's what it is. Oh, and such gorgeous comments from everybody in the text, Sarah, for you and Jill, and just absolutely wonderful. And a big, huge thank you to Kate, who has masterminded all of this in the background, which has been no mean feat, and has really made it run so smoothly, and was there at the beginning when we had the conversation with Sarah about, wow, imagine if we had a book club, and has just taken it on, and it's wonderful. So I think Mary Kelly has just put, thank you for this moving hour. As a nurse who believes in the power and importance of nursing and wants to see us move more involved in structural change for improved health for all, this is confirmatory and inspiring. Looking forward to next session. So I think that's a lovely way to end with that. And we will see you, absolutely phenomenal. We will see you all. What's the next date, Kate?
It's mid-February, but I'll send all information for that. I'll send this recording, and I'll send the links of how to buy Sarah's book as well.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. And did we cover the 2 free books? We have got 2 books to give out.
Not yet, actually. Yeah, go for that.
Okay, so we have 2 free books signed by Sarah, and we'll do a random pick of the people who've joined actually this evening, and we will get them to you. And we will announce who they are if you're happy with that. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day, morning, night, sleep, wherever you are in the world. And God bless you all. Take care. Bye. Bye.